Welcome to the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada's Election Focus Series. This is the first of 7 videos that we'll be producing over the coming weeks that identify the major strategic issues in the Asia Pacific that we as a foundation think are important for the Canadian government to be considering in the run-up to the fall election. This video series is part of a broader initiative we have within the foundation to provide policy advice to the incoming government. It'll be followed on by a policy paper to be released after the election. Today's episode is on Hong Kong. We hope you enjoy this video. Thank you.
Most people remember the 2014 umbrella movement. And what I really want to highlight here is many of these people, even though they weren't successful in acquiring their ultimate goal, which was universal suffrage, they did have some very important things that happened after the movement. Many young people in Hong Kong, they formed political parties, they ran in elections, and they were successful. They became politicians, so they were no longer just activists. But what's been happening is that these goalposts have been changing, and in many respects, the government has been kind of changing the rules of the game as they've been playing it. And so what happened in Hong Kong is that many of these young people were expelled from their elected positions in office. And so what we're seeing now is a response to all of this. We've seen many young Hong Kongers come on the streets because they've tried working within the political system. They've tried to make change from within, but ultimately it hasn't happened because the rules of the game have been changing.
Initially, it worked quite well. Everybody was very nervous that in 1997, China was going to move in with a heavy hand, and of course, China did not. It gave room to Hong Kong to breathe. Now that oxygen seems to be increasingly pumped out of the room, and particularly amongst the young generation, the ones that are maybe 25 years old now, who have a real stake in this, because 2047 is when this 50-year period runs out. In fact, it seems to be running out much faster than that.
There have been some very cogent analysis pieces out there in the media, Orville Schell in particular, comparing Hong Kong to the Tiananmen situation, and I was at Tiananmen the entire time, and so I was pretty familiar with the circumstances there. And there are many, many parallels: disarray in the leadership, diffusion and factionalism within the student movement, periods when it looked like things were going to work themselves out, to be thrown off the rails by an increase in violence or a radical group takes over a demonstration or what have you. So we see many of those things going on in Hong Kong. We should be resistant to the conclusion that that will necessarily lead to the same kind of crackdown as happened in Tiananmen. So we ought to allow in our own mind and in terms of our projections about what might happen, we need to leave space for the possibility that it'll be a kind of a protracted, negotiated, kind of messy, nobody's really happy with it, but they're not on the streets and there's not violence and so on. May very well end up being something like that. I think all of that really depends on the political health of Xi Jinping. There have been indicators over the last year or so, even going beyond the last year, of dissatisfaction with Xi Jinping within China. Both popularly because of the impact on the economy as a result of the trade war in the United States, but also politically in part as a result of the presidency for life question, which changes the whole structure of political advancement and patronage within the senior leadership.
So I could see 4 potential scenarios to the ongoing protests right now in Hong Kong. The first is that the Hong Kong government, particularly with Beijing, engage with civil society groups around the protests to address some of the underlying socio-economic conditions that have led to the protests in the first place. I think this is probably a best case scenario. A second potential option is that the protests just lose momentum, that they fall off like the umbrella movement in 2014 as people go back to school, as the general cost to Hong Kong grows and people just kind of tire of the protests. A third potential outcome could just be a further crackdown in Hong Kong around political and economic and social institutions that really would undermine Hong Kong's status as a special administrative zone or special administrative region of China. And I think the fourth scenario, which in my opinion, of course, is the worst case scenario, is the use of force by Beijing, either through the People's Armed Police or the People's Liberation Army, to restore order in Hong Kong, at least from Beijing's perspective.
Some measure of amnesty for the demonstrators is going to be essential in order for them to have confidence that they will not be punished for what they believe to be a legitimate expression of their political views. And if Hong Kong wants to continue to maintain an image in the world where freedom of expression is still valuable and the rule of law is still valued, I think some sort of amnesty for the vast majority of demonstrators would be really an essential step, a prelude actually to further negotiations and a prelude to a commission inquiry.
I don't think the military crackdown would be in the interest of Beijing, especially when right now it's approaching to the 17th anniversary of China on October 1st, and also China is seeing slowdown of its economy due to the US-China trade war. The narrative, official narratives have been trying to depict Hong Kong protests as challenging the national stability to China and also championing Western interests. Another long-term strategy that China has taken is to promote the status of Shenzhen as a more autonomous special economic zone with more reforms of its economy and financial system. And that sends a message that Hong Kong needs China more than China needs Hong Kong today. On the international stage, the damage of the Hong Kong protest that is done to Hong Kong economy will bring damage to China's reputation as a more open and market-oriented economy, which will bring question about the security and stability of doing business in China.
So we have a very large number of passport holders, as I think is well known. The figure I've heard is between 300 and 350,000. So we have a huge stake. We also have, I think, certainly the largest Canadian Chamber of Commerce outside Canada. It's a very effective organization, a lot of business.
There are important Canadians, both here and actually in Hong Kong, who could play a very constructive role in those kinds of discussions. And part of it is not about advocating right or wrong. Part of it is not an adversarial relationship between the government and the society, but rather a kind of a reconciling approach, which would be relational and much more in keeping with local expectations about those kind of institutional relationships. I think there are prominent Canadians both here and in Hong Kong who could visibly play a role in that, and by so doing remind Beijing of how helpful Canada can be on occasion and how it's not in their interest to have this relatively minor, frankly, spat with Canada. From their perspective, relatively minor. It's not minor for us, but it's fairly minor for them. It could help them appreciate that it's really not in their interest to keep that percolating. They gain almost nothing from it, and it hurts them.
In the case of Hong Kong, there are a number of things that I think really taking the diaspora into account would make a difference in terms of how the Canadian government views the issue in Hong Kong. So I think that the Canadian government should be doing more. And this is not just because Canadians will now be able to vote in the next election, but also to ensure that we are taking advantage of a very valuable resource that we don't tend to do at the moment.